Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show that lifts the light off the world, or should I say shines it, onto the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. A world which I spent at least 30 years in, and also a world in which I was involved in the geopolitical repercussions, I guess, of that particular world. And this is what we want to do in our show, is basically involve you, the listeners, and hopefully in time to come a much wider public into that world. Because actually we carry out actions in your name, but unfortunately, often you don't understand that we're doing these actions in your name. So it's about education. It's about keeping you aware of what's going on and what has gone on and the reasons why. Today's guest is somebody whom I am absolutely happy to have on board. I'm very, very, very proud to have him on the show. This is an individual who is not just an author, not just a historian, not even just a publisher, or not even the top selling agent in the world. And I did say the world, so in terms of literary agent, often that's been the case with Andrew. It's Andrew Lownie. I want him to just tell you a little bit about himself, and then we're going to kick off into some areas which I think and I hope you're going to find actually very interesting, that have to do with the secret world, because that's a lot of Andrew's writings, and more widely about the British system and even the British class system. So, Andrew, thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, Carlton, thank you very much for asking me. It's very nice to be in touch again. As you say, I've been an agent since 1984, have run my own agency since 1988. And alongside my work as an agent, I represent about 250 authors. I also write books. So the first was a biography of a writer called John Buchan, then a spy called Guy Burgess, then 2 years ago, a book on the Mountbattens, Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten, and then in August, a book called Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And alongside that, I've become a sort of campaigner for freedom of information. My background as a historian has made me convinced that we don't really get the true history of our country. A lot of it is censored, a lot of the documents are destroyed. And as you say, a lot of things are done in the name of the public, which they are perfectly not aware of. So the books have increasingly, I suppose, come to challenge establishment cover-ups and to seek through the Freedom of Information Act and various other means, ways of opening up our history so that we're actually more aware of what's been done in our name.
Now, that sounds abstract, but let me give you a real life scenario. One of my listeners called Mikey Crossdale, who in his late 20s, coming up to 30, has never had any interest whatsoever in the history of his country. And it was because he never felt part of it. Now, one of the reasons he put that on is because he's black, i.e. mixed race, but that means at least one of his parents were white and from Britain. But of course, the others were too. If they were from the Caribbean, they've been British since the 1630s, 1640s. So what is it in our society that basically has people believe that they're not part of the society, albeit that everything about them is? And is that an aspect of class? Is it an aspect of poor educational processes? Or is it just that we wanted to show a vision of England? And let's be realistic, because when I was growing up, it was England. We never really spoke about the United Kingdom. That is somewhat unrealistic. And I want to go down that avenue soon. I just want to put that sort of broader perspective to you first, Andrew, and get your ideas.
I think possibly people don't feel they identify with for instance, the island story. It's not their story, it's someone else's story. But I think also there's a problem with teaching history. Most of the history we get is macro history. It's the big movements. And I think the best history is history we can relate to. So I'm a great believer in, for example, family and house histories, micro histories, where you can study something that you know something about your house or your family, and you can relate to that because they're the people exactly like you or people who've lived in the place that you live in. And I think if you have that sense of the place and how you fit into the story, then you're going to be able to move to the much bigger picture stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's why one of the first things I wanted to sort of discuss with you about before we come into your books and other things is basically a sense of empire and how that fits into Brexit. Because I think that Brexit is the last hurrah of empire. To me, and this is my perspective, and please tell me where I'm wrong, because I really do want you to say this isn't correct or that isn't correct from my perspective. If that's the case, please don't be one of these guests who is very loyal and then say, oh yes, I think that might be the case. No, I want you really to come back at me if it's not the case. My vision of empire is this. Most of the empire, I believe, was actually created on the back of commerce. So you've got the East India Company, the West India Company. These were commercial entities going out, creating something that then brings about a need for the British state to come in after them. You can see that with Cecil Rhodes throughout the whole of Africa, to be quite truthful. So from my perspective, so I think empire creates that process. And then what it does is it basically utilizes what I call a monopoly process. A process that says, right, we can get bauxite from here, gold from there, textiles from there. Indeed, we can even destroy the Indian textile industry, recreate it in Lancashire, and then sell the goods to India. So the process, the raw material or the finished textile back to India. So the process was one of a monopoly. And that was great for 2, 3, 4 centuries. But then what happens when that empire begins to crumble is that monopoly is no longer there. And hence, I think monopolies create a kind of laziness, particularly for salespeople, particularly for creators, because they don't need to create particularly good products because you can sell them, because Indians need to buy British cars and so on and so forth. I think
the debate really is between protectionism and free trade, which has always been a tension in British history. The European Community was set up in some ways to sustain the British Empire. It had lost a role. Its only way of playing on the world stage was to join up with other European nations. And of course, this was a continuation of, in some ways, the alliances of the 19th century and the work together after the Second World War. So that was a sort of inevitable sort of linking together. But yes, there's always been this little, I suppose, two strands of Brexit, the little Englanders who just want to England and think that they can operate on their own. And then the sort of more internationalist Brexiteers who believe in free trade and didn't want the protectionism of the European Union. So I think those were that's the trope is actually much more to do with protectionism and free trade. And as you say, it is trade. And of course, the flag follows trade. And then, of course, there are ways of trying to justify it, which may be religion or culture or whatever it is.
Absolutely.
We just have to see what happens. Because, of course, there is no real free trade. People always stick up tariffs and try and protect their markets.
Well, that's the problem with the idea that the Brexiteers looking for free trade, to my perspective, was that the model for that was the empire. When the very last thing the empire was free trade. Yes, it was trade within the empire, but there was a lot of elements out with the empire that prevented movement from other empires. Because let's face it, France had an empire, the Netherlands had an empire.
It wasn't free trade, it was protectionism within the empire. In some ways, the European Union was in some ways just a successor to the British Empire, just a whole group of countries together. So, that did shut out people. That was one of the arguments.
Totally and utterly agree. Totally and utterly agree. So that's my perspective on it. So you get that. And when we then look back and we then create the idea of Brexit based on that, what I'm saying is you've got a flawed perspective from day one. Plus, politically anyway, I think that when we were brought into the European Union, it wasn't the European Union, obviously then the EC or whatever else, I could see that what was perceived by the then Prime Minister was, this is, as you said, the only way we can remain great. But it's even more skillful than that, because I can remember being on protection with Douglas Hurd, and I spoke to him about, I can't remember what the action was. It was an action. I said, why are we always continually following the United States? And he said to me, you're only something if you can punch above your weight. And with the US, we punch above our weight. And I perceive the European Union in the same way. We acted as a bridge, the bridge from the US into the European Union, and from the European Union into the US to a lesser extent, because we had this, and the Europeans believed it, this perspective that we can actually, in some way, shape or means, orient the US to policies which are of interest to Europe, i.e. the European Union, and from the US, we were carrying their message.
Sure. I mean, we had NATO after all,
Correct.
That was the punching above our weight, and the seat at Security
Council.
To Council with the UN. But in some ways, joining the EU seemed to me to be allowing the US would be happy, in sense, to deal with the European Union, and it was a force. We see it in publishing. We're getting bigger and bigger blocks, because the only way to deal with Amazon, or the only way to deal with a big publisher, is to have a big agency, or vice versa. So, we're all having to create these units in order to punch above our weight, as you say. Otherwise, we'll just get picked off.
Correct. And that's the problem, because once you got a president in the US that was fearful of the US's hegemony and its number one position in the world, and was fearful of the European Union becoming more powerful, a bloc which actually didn't have to do what the US said, he clearly wanted to defeat that process. And of course, China is now the biggest benoit for the US. So I could see how that president, i.e. Trump, wished to break the US up. And I think some in Britain, not the US, the European Union up, and some in Britain fell for that, assuming that would be the case. But I don't think that the Europeans have the same, we have the same baggage of the Europeans. Because when I used to live in Europe, all I could see throughout the whole thing, and I lived in Germany, so in the center of it, throughout the whole thing was the fact that, we created this, they say, because we don't want any more wars. We know what that means. We struggled through these wars. Britain's never really felt that. And I don't think that weighed very heavily in Britain's perspective at all. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, exactly. I mean, the determination to create the European Union was to prevent wars ever happening again, and in some ways to check the power of Germany.
Yes, absolutely.
But I do think that in some ways, you say, just because we're not a nation and we haven't had the same security concerns being invaded, there's still clearly opposition to the European Union and the growth of the European Union and its powers in all sorts of places. I mean, we see movements in France and Germany, and particularly in Eastern Europe, and actually now in Southern Europe, who are one of the great beneficiaries of the European Union. So I think it's one of the problems that all these institutions get too big, and they begin to lose touch with the people that they're meant to represent.
Yeah,
there are too many conflicting demands on it.
Again, I have never thought the European Union was perfect. It could be an imperfect union, if you want to put it that way. But I thought that what it did do is it, first of all, created the goal which it wanted to do primarily from Adenauer and Schumacher and others, was to have no war. That's the first thing. Second thing is that I think it lessened internal competition within Europe, which is a good thing because that led to conflict. And the third thing, I think it made citizens feel much more European. So in the beginning, I imagine that it was a club for the winners, for the wealthy, for the ruling elite, if you want to put it all those ways that some in the Labour Party used to hate. But actually, I think it also aided and abetted the general working class, general normal Brit, normal Spaniard, normal whatever, who had opportunities to move around and create a new world for themselves in another country, which was their country still, in a sense.
Well, clearly a lot of the health safety legislation and all these, a lot of the rules, minimum wage and things, came in from Europe. I mean, that there were different standards on the continent that were introduced here as a result of our membership, which I think was to our benefit. And that, of course, is again part of this debate of how far do you, in a sense, have a very liberal economy, and how far do you have a status economy, which in a sense protects the vulnerable.
Absolutely. So that was, I just wanted to get your feel on that, so empire and Brexit and the whole perspective that we had there. And one of the reasons why I believe that we are now behind in things like manufacturing, because of the imperial past, not a result of it being positive to us, but the negative hitting us at that particular time. And I think Margaret Thatcher saw this and closed down companies, decided not to support them, which, you could argue one way or the other was a positive or a negative. For me, probably a negative. One could have put more government funds into some of the industries, but chose not to, and has basically gone down the world of finance as the route to bring the UK and services to bring the UK to the world. And I don't know if that will, in the end, fully work. Anyway, that was that perspective. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about, because you are steeped in intelligence, I wanted to speak to you about the British intelligence system, of which I was part, and your understanding of, one, for example, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. What do you know about it?
Well, we don't know very much, because again, and maybe that's a good thing, because clearly they have to do very sensitive work with their anti-terrorism, particularly anti-terrorism work. And so, there've been a few books and there's a bit of coverage, and that's understandable. I think national security does need to be protected, and certainly as part of my fight for freedom of information doesn't relate to national security issues, which, unless there are good reasons for it to be open and it doesn't damage the country. But yeah, I think there are lots of these organizations, not just Special Branch, which is well known, but lots of secret organizations which you'll know about, which we just don't know about. And there's no, of course, transparency, and there's no proper supervision of them. And I think one of the problems also is they, in a sense, police themselves. There are very few outside bodies who will, we have now the Intelligence and Security Committee in the House of Commons, which has a bit more teeth to do things, but otherwise, they can just do what they want, and they can hide behind national security, and that can cover up all sorts of incompetence and corruption.
Yeah, the reason why I ask you about the branch is because I believe the branch is now disbanded and has been since 2006, but of course it was, for want of a better word, the first organized intelligence, let's say, intelligence and security agency in the UK back in 1883 to fight the Fenian. So it had 100 years plus of history, but I get the feel throughout my time in the branch and in other agencies that people didn't understand it. I felt that politicians had zero understanding, so much so that we now have this undercover policing investigation. They talk about policing. They don't understand that actually what you're looking at there is intelligence acquisition processes. So, and it's as though, as you know, every intelligence agency works off its agents. So if you have an agent, you protect that agent 100% all the way through. But if officers are now being outed by the system, how can agents believe that they will be supported? And you cannot differentiate between the agency being a police agency, because, frankly, in most countries, the police agency is the security service. We are an absolute anomaly in the United Kingdom, because in most countries, it's a police agency that is a security service. You need Special Branch or another agency like it, now the Counter-Terrorism Command, because the security service, MI5, have no police powers whatsoever. So
exactly. The Special Branch are in some ways the public face of MI5, But I mean, they shouldn't be outing officers or agents. I mean, the whole point about keeping things secret is that there is this lifelong commitment, and that goes down the generations, that you won't release agents' names because there may be reprisals on descendants. And that's particularly true in places like Northern Ireland. So I'm surprised if that's happening, and that's wrong if people are outing officers and agents, because the system can't work if people don't have complete confidence in it.
Well, absolutely. And what they've done is they've outed the officers. They've said officers are doing X, Y, and Z. We'll try and keep agents separate. But how do you keep agents separate from the officers who, after performing a particular role, are agent handlers? You see, so if I'm an agent handler, I'm handling an agent from wherever in the world, and then I'm outed as an officer, that's a big problem, because that agent now is wondering, when will I be next? And these are ongoing cases. So to me, when the Home Secretary brought this forward, and this is what I wanted to ask you, Andrew, was it a matter that the Home Secretary didn't understand what this part of the police was and what it was doing?
Well, I think we do have a problem with politicians being posted into jobs that are not always qualified to run, and there's a rapid turnover. But I mean, this is the point of having the continuity of the civil service, that they should be advising ministers. And I think maybe one of the problems is that ministers are now not listening to the civil service in the way they used to. Or civil servants have become politicized, and those who, in a sense, are the old school, are being driven out for political appointees, in effect. Special advisors are having a bigger role, and people know that they need to basically kowtow to their minister for their preferment, rather than speak truth to power.
Actually, from what I've seen, Andrew, is that they kowtow to special advisors. Special advisors now become the all-powerful with very little knowledge, frankly.
Exactly. No, I think it is a real problem. And we have also the attempts to bring people into the civil service from other careers, which is good. I mean, bring in business training, for example, is a good thing. But I think it disturbs the culture. I mean, that's deliberate to disrupt it. But I mean, the culture of service and loyalty to the institution, I think, is being undermined.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
There's no real commitment. People are just there on the job, and they'll move on quite soon.
Correct. Indeed, one of the crowning glories of the British system was its civil service and its Foreign and Commonwealth Office and whatever else, capable individuals working on behalf of the state, not for government, but on behalf of the state. I think that was a crowning glory. And I think it's been massively undermined. Would you be thinking that yourself? Is there any idea of books in that sphere, or?
Yes, I think the old traditions of the civil service have been undermined. I mean, maybe that's just the mark of a modern society. But yeah, there is nostalgia for that. But maybe it never was perfect. I mean, maybe we've had Yes Minister after all. That's the other flip side, where the civil servants, in a sense, were running the country, not always in the interest of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, it's all about balance, isn't it? It's all about balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I noted when Cummings was speaking out quite recently on the interview that he had on the BBC, I mean, I found it unbelievable that he sat there and said, we realised that when the Prime Minister's girlfriend, would never call her his wife, when the Prime Minister's girlfriend actually got power, we realised, and because the Prime Minister had won the election with a tremendous amount of seats that we never thought would be the case, we realised we had to get rid of him. And I remember thinking, hang on, have you just said that? We had to get rid of him. And then when Laura Kongsberg said, in fact, she said 2 months after you've just won the top election, the biggest number of seats for many, many years, you're talking about getting rid of the Prime Minister. And he said, and I'm quoting now, who said anything about 2 months after? It was the next day. So this guy's talking about making a coup the very next day, when he said several other people, he didn't name them, were planning to get rid of the Prime Minister. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think people just want instant gratification, and I think we're much more divisive than we were. People were more accepting. People want elections, and they should. But, I think people just expect to have their own way, and they're less prepared now to accept that we're part of a community, and we have to accept majority decisions.
So, Andrew, what I was wondering is, Would you think that this would be an area that you could actually write a book about, so to inform people how the closed door circumstances work in number 10 in the Cabinet Office and around the civil service and government in general?
Well, I like personalizing history. That's why I write biography. I like to try and understand why people tick, why they do certain things. But within all the books, really, there has been this theme of establishment cover-up, either, with Guy Burgess, the cover-up of the flight, and then the cover-up of the story afterwards, or with Mountbatten, the way that he curated his story and the way indeed the government tried to cover up some of the revelations about Mountbatten, including his paedophilia. And of course, with the Traitor King, the most recent book, there was the cover-up during the Duke of Windsor's own lifetime of his work with the Nazis, and then the attempt subsequently to shape the narrative and to create this myth around him. So the books are all dealing with this, the way that the government can operate, governments in general can operate. But I like to hang it around a particular issue and a particular personality rather than to write in the abstract. I think that's much more effective and people can understand that better.
So in effect, then, you could write maybe about the President Prime Minister or about Cummings and work it around that.
Well, the problem is that there won't be papers now. I mean, I suspect there will never be papers to look at. And the reason I like looking at perhaps the first 60, 70 years of this century is that people did write things down and things did get into the archives and we therefore have a picture. I think the problem now with sofa government and with the encryption and all sorts of things, the way that people like Dominic Cummings' work and Alistair Campbell before him, is that nothing gets written down and nothing therefore can be written about by historians afterwards. We only can interview people and we have their memories or maybe their notes, but we just don't have that civil service note-taking that took place before. Yeah. So that's a real problem, again, in disguising the history of our nation, because we will not have, shall we say, a third-person view. We'll just have the very partial view of the people involved. And that was one of the problems with Mountbatten in the notes he took during partition. He actually wrote up the notes of the meetings himself, which of course went through the prism of the way he wanted to present them. Yeah. So, that's one of the problems. I mean, the historians need these documents to build our picture of the past, and these documents are not available. I mean, they were available and were destroyed or not released, but now they're not even available at all.
So do you need the documents to create a picture of the past if you've got interviews, or do you really need the documents? Because then what you have is, if you will, an evidential trail that you can say, you may be saying this now, but you actually said that in the documentation. Is that more the evidential trail that you're looking at?
You need both. You need both. You need the more material you have, the more corroboration you have. But clearly, reports by independent observers at the time are likely to be more accurate than people's memories, even if they aren't trying to spin the story much later on. And our memories are all defective, and of course we all see things as we would like them to have been presented. Sure. So interviews can be useful for color and the things that don't get put down in documents. And that's why diaries and letters are also very important, because often people write those with no view except to communicate to themselves or to the person they're writing to, as opposed to writing for history. And those are the most valuable sources because they're pure in many ways. But everything in terms of creating this trail is important. I mean, the documents can often give you some hints: who saw them, what they said, the notes on the document, when they saw them. All those things are important. So they give you a lot of information. And I mean, from your intelligence background, the importance of surveillance reports in documentation. So there, we have telephone taps, so we actually have the absolute dialogue at the time. We'll have surveillance, so we know who they saw and where they went and how they behaved, even down to physical descriptions. And that's invaluable for the biographer, because that helps build a picture.
Now, that's a fantastic segue, as they say in this industry, into what I now wanted to speak about, which are the books. And one of the first ones I wanted to look to is The Traitor King. And one of the reasons being also is because I had a little bit to do with that in terms of the branch back in the day, in the 1930s, was tasked at looking at the would-be king. And I'm thinking, as I'm saying it now, what we released and what we didn't. So
That's very interesting. So you are aware of special branch files on the Duke of Windsor from the 1930s,
Absolutely.
from the surveillance, because
Absolutely.
their argument is there's very little, that there's no material.
Right. In 2000? Actually, no, rubbish. It'd be 2000 because on the same day I jumped on a plane to go to Iraq. So it would just be in the middle of the Iraq War. And what was happening was I was running the section of the branch that provided personal protection, the office of that. And I had been tasked with looking under the 70-year rules at information and the files on the king. And use my little bit of reticence because I'm thinking what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, because you know what the Official Secrets Act is like. So I'm making sure that I'm 100% right in how what I'm saying. So what my task was to look at those files, to read those bits of the file in whilst I was doing various other things that we were doing. And what you've got to realize in the branch, and this is, openly to say that, you've got protection files, you've then got personal files, you've then got files that relate to operational files, because you can be part of a file as an operation but not have a personal file. You can be part of a file in terms of protection but not have a personal file that relates to operations. Do you see what I mean? They're different processes.
What would be in a protection file, for example, for the Duke of Windsor?
So
would those be the reports from his protection officers back to special branch?
Right. I'd better explain what the branch does. Special branch had several different roles. So A squad was personal protection. So special branch officers perform personal protection. There are also intelligence officers. So clearly there's intelligence. I'll put it that way, just that way, nice and easy. B squad was Irish. So we dealt nationally on behalf of the United Kingdom. So when I say national, I'm talking about Great Britain and to some extent into Northern Ireland as well and beyond. It was our role to deal with the Irish Republican conflict and obviously also for loyalists as well, but particularly Republicans. So that was B squad. C squad dealt with homegrown activities. So that was subversion. It was extreme left wing, extreme right wing, public disorder, counter-espionage, counter-proliferation, blah, 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 blah. So that was C squad, but homegrown. E squad was doing all those things, but from the perspective of it being external, i.e. individuals living in the United Kingdom who were from elsewhere. And if you think that, the UK controlled a third of the world's population and a third of the world's landmass, practically anybody whomever wanted to be the ruler of their country and wanted to plan some plot to carry out whatever dastardly stuff in their land actually did it in the United Kingdom and did it more than ever in London. So frankly, our role was to look at that from that perspective. And that also had liaison with, and I was in the European liaison section, so because I'm a German and a Dutch speaker, I speak with German colleagues doing the same role and Dutch colleagues doing the same role. And so we had those European liaison sections. And then there was also liaison, obviously, with close partners, the United States, Canada, Australia, etc.
But what's interesting is that you were also reviewing your historical files of what they've been doing in the 30s.
Correct.
So there was extensive coverage of the Duke of Windsor then.
Yes, because we control ports as well. So if you came in and out of the port, particularly in the 1930s, because it was all MPSB, I'm sure to make it clear, Metropolitan Police Special Branch, so Scotland Yard Special Branch. Right. What happened is, up until 1964, there was only one special branch, that was MPSB, Metropolitan Police Special Branch. Post 64, when the number of police forces came down from 115, 120 down to 48, then each of those little forces got their own special branch. They were only small and they weren't full-time. I should also say, in the Met, you were a full-time special branch officer. So there were a massive amount of examinations which you had to pass to get into the branch. And once you did, you generally stay in the branch for your career. So with me, I passed those exams after 2 years and all the posts that went. So the rest of my time was in special branch. That's it. Other people, more general, it was probably about 5 years. And then you'd stay the rest of your time in special branch. So you moved around all of these squads. Yeah, all of them. And the various different elements of the different squads. We had our own surveillance teams, of which we had 5 or 6, which we throughout the whole country. We trained all the other special branches and indeed some of the special branches from colonial countries, which were still connected. We did even overseas courses for Americans, say, and stuff like that. So the branch was actually a big organization, which was as big as some police forces, or the smaller forces, but you were only an SB officer and that's all you did. And obviously you worked in tandem on many of these issues with the security service, especially espionage. With the security service, you're working in tandem. But many of them were not the security service's purview, because the branch worked to what we call the Queen's peace, and before it would have been the King's peace. So anything political that undermined the King's peace or the Queen's peace subsequently. The security service was a defence of the realm, so it was very much more specific. So that's where it went. But there was a total symbiosis between the security service and the branch. And basically we went to their place to study their processes, and some people from them were with us. So there was and we could check their records and so on and so forth. So there was a very close system of communication. So in answer to your files, a protection file would basically look at the SB officer who is providing protection, and obviously one wouldn't be noting intelligence generally on British individuals unless that was something that was requested, or something had not been right, or the officer providing protection felt that there was a need to report. And because he's an intelligence officer, so he's reporting intelligence as he perceives it or she perceives it, and that gets reported. So in terms of up to 1936 and then subsequent, they had clearly been asked to look closer at the individual, and more importantly, his wife to be. And so I released files which basically said that. So I can remember from the top of my head, where example, the SB officer was in the US, and as I said, they did ports. So that also meant ships that went backwards and forwards. Some SB officers were on there because the Irish problems as well coming out of Boston. That was perceived to be something one needed to look at. And basically, they reported about her activities in Harlem with another socialite, a very wealthy socialite. And they also noted that at the same time as being with the future king, she was with a person of dubious, I think he wrote something like that, of dubious manners or something like that he wrote at the time.
There's a file on a guy called Guy Trundle, who's a car salesman here.
Correct. That is him.
That's the man. Yeah,
that is him.
Yeah. That file has been released, actually.
Correct. I released that. Yeah. That's what I released.
Well, thank you very much.
Right.
It's a very important file.
Because
it's interesting that not everything was released, though. But
no, and that's why I'm thinking what I'm saying. That's why I'm thinking what I'm saying.
Yeah, but the files are there. That's interesting, because the line that they take is that there are no files; they were destroyed.
Well, the file might be destroyed now. Who knows?
Right.
You see, the branch was disbanded in 2006, and I know they destroyed a whole lot of files. We had a file there for 120 years, which obviously were then, there's no longer any special branch. So why do you need those files?
We want them in the archives. That's our history.
It's gone to the counter-terrorism branch. Yeah. So it's changed from the special branch to basically the security service won. There was a question brought up by a man who would subsequently become the leader of the Labour Party, who said, do we need a security service now that the Iron Curtain, was his words, has fallen? Right? So there was this movement from some people, particularly in Labour, to say we don't need a security service. That obviously made the security service somewhat frightened, and then they lobbied and started moving. So what do you want to do? You want to get rid of the one service that can take the place of you, which is the branch, MPSB, Metropolitan Police Special Branch. Yeah. So they worked hard to undermine the special branch. Yeah, Scotland Yard Special Branch. Because it was an organisation that was totally controlled in itself. And of course, if you want to look at the branch as part of the Metropolitan Police Service, which is a service with altogether, 50-odd thousand people, it's a big organisation. So it could have functioned like they do in Europe, in France, say, where the DST or the AG or all those agencies were part of the police. And that would have undermined the security service. So I don't think the branch really understood what the attack was from the security service, and basically aided its own demise. But that's the files, absolutely. I would say that because I was part of the organisation, but I think it was a great organisation. I think it did its job well. I think it wasn't massively repressive. It knew what it was doing, and it was a sensible organization. So those files, were released. Sorry, we went a little bit further into it than we should have done.
No, fascinating.
So it's that type of thing which I think the public, and that's why when I wrote it, I said I think the public need to know this when I wrote it, and I don't think it's a problem for them knowing this. Maybe there's some embarrassment, but other than that, there's no, if you will, sensitivity in terms of national security. Now, you're going even deeper into the king. You're looking at his activities with the Nazi Party at the time, the NSDAP, and you're looking at how his activities were in Bermuda, obviously British imperial country, which had its own special branch, which connected with the United Kingdom special branch. And so you're looking into those things, which I find fascinating. And you found out a hell of a lot.
Yes, well, I mean, clearly the links with the Nazis were much closer than I think people realize, that he was much more of an active intriguer with the Nazis, who were keen to put him on the throne should they win the war as a British Pétain figure. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, he's sent by Churchill to the Bahamas as governor to keep him away from, in some ways, the Europe and also any threat to his brother, who was trying to establish himself on the throne. Mm-hmm. But in the Bahamas, he gets involved with some pretty shady characters, some financial irregularities. But I think most importantly, he's involved in the murder of Harry Oakes, or rather the cover-up of the murder of Harry Oakes, who's probably the richest man on the Bahamas. And that is very interesting, as you say, because I found in the files that he actually asked for the Commissioner of Police.
Sorry, Andrew, files, FBI files, or what files?
Well, there's a lot of stuff in FBI files, but there's also stuff in Colonial Office files.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that the files in the National Archives here for the Colonial Office have been weeded, but those in the Bahamas have not. Right. So that will, for example, show that he tried to post, and he successfully posted, the Commissioner of Police in the Bahamas to Trinidad and took him away from the investigation into the Oakes murder. And he brought in people who weren't in special branch, who would have been qualified to do the job. He brought in some FBI agents who were not qualified to do so and who he could control, and didn't ask any awkward questions about the murder.
Interesting. You see, straight away, why are you bringing in Americans into a British?
Exactly. And I think this is the big question. I mean,
and how was that allowed?
Well, I think the governor has extraordinary powers to do what he wants. And he would argue Miami was a lot closer than trying to bring someone from London or even from special branch in New York. But you're right, it's a scandal that he was able to do that. And there was a Scotland Yard investigation later into the death, which again is still closed. We don't know exactly what they found. Which again, this is a bit of history. This murder took place 80 years ago, and surely we should know now what the investigation found.
So when you're looking for your papers and you put in requests under the Freedom of Information Act UK. Have you ever done a dual one where you do Freedom of Information Act UK, Freedom of Information Act USA, and have you then looked at the differences, or maybe even Australia or Canada, and have you then looked at what you get back and you can compare and contrast? Have you ever sort of done that?
Yes, I put in dozens of requests for each book. I mean, probably over 100, and they have to be specific to the archives they have. So, but yes, for example, with Mountbatten, I put in requests here and in the States. You can't make them too wide in general because then they want specific questions.
Understandably.
But that clearly brought me the files on Mountbatten and his paedophilia. It is difficult because you don't know what you're asking for if you don't know what's there, and that's one of the problems. But yeah, certainly, for example, in the Harry Oakes case, I asked for material from here and from the FBI. In fact, neither claimed to have anything.
Okay.
So that's one of the problems. You know, as you say, documents get destroyed, or they say have been destroyed, or they can't find them. And it's very difficult. You know, how do you challenge if they say we don't have them when you think they must have them? You know, I thought they must have, but a special branch must have files on protection of the Duke of Windsor because I'd seen one or two of them, the ones you released. But you know, if you now say that some of the rest were destroyed, the only token one.
I don't say they were destroyed. What I say is they
But may have been destroyed.
Could have been weeded, because there is a weeding process, and that process became much more vigorous. One, because of data protection elements, and two, really, at the end of the branch. So I don't have a clue now what's been kept and what hasn't been kept.
Yeah, and I think that's the sad thing. There probably isn't a record anywhere of what's kept or gone. I mean, they say they don't even keep records of what's destroyed, so we don't even know what may have existed. And I think that the problem is records management is not what people like the Special Branch are worried about. They're worried about doing their job. But I think we need more records specialists coming in and working alongside operational police officers and historians.
The branch had a massive records section. The whole of the 19th floor of Scotland Yard was SB records, as we call them, because we needed to search. And everything you do, you searched the records for. And I'm not speaking out of turn here. I'm very careful with what I'm saying now. Everything you did, you'd search SBR, which is Special Branch Records. You'd search sometimes security service records, right? Because you want to orientate the person. So if I'm doing a fully comprehensive review, as we used to call it, on Andrew Lownie, I want to know from the day you were born to what you do right now. Okay? So I go through everything and I produce that finished document. And at the end of that document, there's a whole list of what the records checks are. Does he have a record here? The whatever, general police records, does he have a record, whatever. So there's a whole line of records. So record keeping was massive in the branch. It was all done by civilians. Let's say if there were 345, 400, latter years, even 800 special branch officers, let's say, then there were 600 civilians doing all these type of things, looking at records, looking at data, looking at doing a whole load of different things within the branch. There weren't just officers, there were civilians. So the data and keeping of records was very, very important. Indeed, when I joined the branch, something I can tell you, and I came in to join it, and you go into records, which is part of your when you learn the processes of the branch. Part of the things you used to spend, I think it was a week doing records with the records people. They were generally women. She said, you are the only SB officer we know of who actually is in SPR, is in Special Branch Records. And what it was is I applied to join the Special Branch to the embassy in Germany. So they wondered, who is this guy applying to join Special Branch, which you don't do, via our embassy in Germany. So they asked the Germans to look at me, and obviously our liaison guy with the Germans to look at us. And so there is a record of that. There was a record of that in the branch. So they kept copious records. I don't know what happened when the branch finished. I would surmise many went to the security service. That's what I would surmise. Others were destroyed and others went into general police records. But if they're in general...
That's the point. The point I'm making, they're destroyed because they're no longer needed for operational work, but that doesn't mean they're not of interest to historians. And I think that's where the problems arise.
No, but if they touch on sensitive issues and agents, and every agent is sensitive, then I would imagine they'd think, we're not going to put this into general police records because they're not used to dealing with agents, because Special Branch was completely separate from general Metropolitan Police records, and only SB officers could view those records. You could send it to the security service if they have an interest, and they would in many, so that probably gone to their records. And those that are sort of hybrid, that is not the security service business, then you've got to decide what you do with them. And if they're sensitive, I guess they must have thought, let's destroy them. Because actually, under the processes of data protection, you could argue they should be weeded. It's an argument of semantics. But for you as a historian, it's terrible, of course.
Exactly. Well, this is all the lost history we don't know about.
Yeah.
But anyway, I mean, the Duke was, I think, just from the evidence I found, not just here, but particularly in places like the States and the Bahamas, there's a lot more material that hasn't been weeded, which clearly paints them in a very damaging light.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic that you do this, because I think that we need to understand what really happens and what really goes on. And as I say, shining the light, which is what this program tries to do, within, and I always say this, within the orbit of, one, not undermining operational activity as it works now, or agent activity of the past, and also national security as it's negative to the country. But that doesn't mean you can't tell the truth. There are two different things, I believe, there. And I know you spent your time trying to tell the truth, but also upholding national security in a sense. And so the Mountbatten one is even much more interesting to me because there are clear criminal offences going on there.
Yes, I mean, the extraordinary thing is that until the 1960s, homosexuality was an offence. People went to prison for it. And until 2000, people couldn't serve in the armed forces if they were gay. And yet Mountbatten was quite blatantly bisexual. I mean, he actually abused his position in the services to seduce younger ratings and officers. And the extraordinary thing is his superiors knew about these predilections and covered them up. And so he had special treatment in a way that other people didn't. But as you say, he could well have been sent to prison if the whole thing had become public and the police had followed through. But I think the thing is, there's one rule for the rich and powerful, another rule for everyone else.
I was going to ask you that, Andrew, why you thought that wasn't the case. Is it just the rich and powerful? Is it the royal connection? Is it that there was a clique within the services? Well, really, it's the Navy, wasn't it, that he was involved in most of the time, within the area that he was, that themselves had reason to hide various issues, or is it a mixture of all three?
Well, he was a senior serving officer, so that would have been an embarrassment. He eventually ended up as chief of defence staff. While in 60, he retired in 65 before the Wolfenden Act even came into power. So you would have had the head of the armed services could have gone to prison for his activities, and what he was administering, basically getting rid of people from the services for their sexuality, he was himself guilty of. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, even if he hadn't been a royal, that would have been a big problem. But clearly, he was the uncle of Prince Philip. He was a cousin of the Queen. Mm-hmm. That was a further embarrassment.
Yes.
So, yeah, of course, and that's back to your thing that it's embarrassment that's often used as the reason for covering up things. Nothing to do with anything else.
Correct. I mean, and the other thing that with that was, both you and I probably think homosexuality laws were wrong. So we say, are we really bothered about homosexuality? But that's not what we're really talking about. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about his predilection to paedophilia, which was,
exactly.
was well known.
Yes, and of course opened him up to blackmail, and there are suggestions that he may have been blackmailed as a result of it. So absolutely.
By whom? Soviets?
Soviets. There's some suggestion that he was recruited by the Soviets as an agent called Admiral. I didn't put that in the book, but that's the line certainly the Russians are pushing. And he was, for example, a supporter of CND, which is slightly unusual for a head of the armed services. Mm-hmm. So who knows? And also, of course, they keep this information and in the hope of using it at some point in the future. Yeah. But they may well have controlled him to make certain decisions, for example, on Polaris or whatever. Yeah. Who knows? I mean, again, all this stuff's covered up. And, you will know better than I if there was an investigation into Mountbatten by Special Branch. But given the FBI had a file on him, I imagine Special Branch did too.
Well, I would, in terms of Mountbatten, you would probably have a tripartite of information. You probably have, number one, the security service would have probably been much heavier involved in that because of the whole India and the full colonial element. You'd have had the branch as it pertained to what one would hear around on the streets and in polite society. So the branch would have something, and in unison it would work with the security service. But the other people who may well have heard something and then passed it to the security service, and sometimes also to the branch, depending on what it is, would be the military policing processes. And by that I mean obviously the Navy, the Army and the Air Force all have different bodies that deal with the provising of criminality. And no doubt somebody will have said at some stage, this guy's doing what you're trying to throw me out for. And that would have been recorded by the military provost elements, be that if it's a naval service or whatever the service was. And that in itself then may have been moved on. So these things generally are not just one body, they come together as a collective, and various people can be working on various things at the same time. So it's probably wider than what you think, Andrew, to be truthful.
Yes, well, I mean, again, no one claims to have any files on Mountbatten, but the files must be there.
Or they've been weeded out.
They get all weeded out. One wonders they'll be revealed.
But or they've been weeded out. Yeah, I've always got to say that because they could just have been weeded out. It's just the way it is. The Indians will no doubt have files. The Indian civil service is very good. The Indian special branch, very, very good. And I've no doubt that they would have had files. And at the end of British rule, those files would have been kept for whatever objective they may well have had. And that's how the Soviets may have got hold of it.
Yes, though I suspect that a lot of the British files on independence were destroyed to
Correct.
save them being given to the Indians. So it's only what they've collected since 1947. But you're right, there may well be stuff in Indian files on Mountbatten.
You see, now what I would say is this, Andrew. This is unfortunately so fascinating, but we're going to have to stop because I only booked you for a certain amount of time, and this is why I do need you back, Andrew. Please come back on the show. But we'll just finish on this one. The way things work is this: yes, the ruling body within the Indian Special Branch and the Indian Secret Service, I can't remember what they call that under the British rule, but it was generally the Special Branch was one of the main tools. The leadership would be British, but many of the officers would have been Indians and others. Now, they're investigating, they're getting information. They know independence is coming up. Which side of the bread are they buttered on? What do they see? What do they report? Are they reporting to Indian bodies? So what I'm saying is, yes, we may have taken official files, but there'll be enough Indians who have had files which had gone into the Indian Special Branch files subsequently, which had come from their offices. Do you see what I mean? Who are still there.
Yes, but that's clearly fresh areas for me to look at.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I booked Andrew. I couldn't get away from Andrew because he's so interesting. And so therefore we had to cut that short. He will come back on the show again, he's told me, which is fantastic. His insight is brilliant. This guy is at the heart of the British system. And you have today had the light well and truly shone on the secret world. So what I'd like to say to you is thank you very much for listening again. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It's a fantastic way to kick off season 2 with Andrew. So that was episode 1, season 2. And we will move on with other great guests, which you will hear in this season as well. So thank you very much and see you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.